Happy birthday, dear NATO. Happy birthday to you. 75 this year. What has the Washington summit achieved? We know the issues involved, so was it just a massive birthday party? And who will blow out the candles, and what will the wish be? Please join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The 75th NATO summit has come to an end. And while Western leaders spent their time in the US productively, questions regarding the alliance's future remain. Historically, NATO summits have proven to be eventful, both in international developments and in personal behaviors. One of the most extreme examples is 2018's Brussels summit, infamous for the antics of then US President Donald Trump. Threatening to pull the US out of NATO, Trump openly attacked some of his allies over their inability to fulfill NATO defense spending guidelines. In the years since the 2018 summit, aggregated defense spending by NATO members, excluding the US, has risen by 55% to around $430 billion. At the time of the summit, just 3 nations besides the US met the 2% of GDP benchmark. This year, 22 will. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a major catalyst for a surge over the past 2 years, particularly in Germany, the seeds of the increase can be traced back to Trump's interventions that summer in Brussels. 6 years later, with NATO existing in a vastly different world, the summit once again produced some new developments.
And today, NATO is better resourced than it ever has been.
A significant amount of focus was placed on the host, US President Joe Biden, who was to use the summit to convince the public of his mental acuity. His performance is not likely to ease the minds of his doubters. The summit witnessed a few of Biden's slip-ups.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President until I think she was not qualified to be President. And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
Nevertheless, Ukraine remained the summit's main priority. The alliance agreed to declare Ukraine's membership in the alliance irreversible, intends to provide $43 billion in military assistance next year, has started transferring F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, and is sending dozens of air defenses, including 4 Patriot missile systems, to Kiev. In a joint declaration, NATO members also condemned Moscow's nuclear threats and called China the decisive enabler in Russia's war against Ukraine. Yet questions regarding the future of NATO remain, with the discussions largely focusing on the upcoming US election.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Professor Marek Madej, a political scientist at the University of Warsaw. Welcome to the programme.
Welcome.
NATO 75 today, very long-standing military alliance. How would you describe the state of health of NATO? It's probably just a bit younger than President Biden.
And it's really fit, I would say, in that sense that, of course, it's 75 years of long cooperation on many difficult issues, so definitely some problems has arisen, but nevertheless, currently, after especially 2022, due to Russian aggression in the Ukraine, NATO started to revitalize itself. In fact, it started earlier in 2014, but what is most important after especially 22, we have very unified alliance. All allies who are there are thinking pretty much the same way about, they are on the same footing as far as threat perception is concerned, as far as need of investment, need of mobilizing forces, need of some form of transformation of the military and strategic posture. So that's something which is really good.
So we've come from this brain-dead description by President Macron to something that's very...
It's funny because it was just 5 years ago.
Yes, that's right.
It was 2019 when definitely it was overestimated by Macron, but he wanted to push NATO into direction of, let's say, rethinking about itself, how decisive it could be as an alliance, how able to make decisions collectively. It was just after or in the middle of the term of President Trump, when the disputes within NATO were very much focused on NATO itself.
The financing and...
especially about burden sharing, that is
yes.
the thing which, from the perspective of especially President Trump, but not only, from many Americans, were simply imbalanced and not just from their perspective, due to the fact that Americans were paid and still are paying majority of, let's say, bills in NATO. But nevertheless, that's something which within 5 years has changed, partially due to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, which gave, let's say, NATO new, or maybe not new, but reminded NATO what the NATO is for.
Well, that's right. I mean, does it need a threat in order to bring its members together?
Well, of course, it's better not to have any threats. That's the best option. But
alliances are formed against...
Exactly. Alliances are working better if they have pretty much defined goal of cooperation, and threat present, clear and, let's say, defined, is something which unifies allies. Although NATO survived also the period when there was no clearly defined threat. That is after, in the beginning of 90s, when we had collapse of Soviet Union.
Yes, and everyone thought
NATO
it
was
peace.
designed and built for dealing with the threat posed by Soviets. When Soviets gone, NATO had to rethink itself, and they found, let's say, new goals. They found, because it's also some kind of insurance policy that is for members. You are in NATO not only because you are under some present threat, but in case something will come, you have already your partners and some institutions. So it's good that NATO survived that period, but even during that period, NATO found some goal. However, having clearly defined threat is, let's say, more
yes.
stimulating to cooperation.
Is it coming back to its roots and its core tasks, namely defending Europe? I mean, there was a period, like you mentioned, 1990s, early 2000s, where it had a kind of expeditionary feel to intervene in the world, and that. Did it overreach itself in any
To some degree, yes. In that sense, that NATO was and still is the most powerful or capable alliance in the history. It's true. NATO is consisting now of 32 countries. It's unusual in history of alliances to have robust alliance with so many members. But nevertheless, even that kind of alliance has some limits. And the problem was that NATO was perceived at the beginning in the 90s as the only capable to do some operations which could stabilize the world. Initially it was Europe, and NATO performed that role relatively well, with successes, or at least maybe not perfect successes like Bosnia or Kosovo, but some kind of, definitely it stabilized the situation. Maybe not solved fully, but stabilized. However, especially after 2001, NATO started to be engaged in many more demanding tasks. It started with especially Afghanistan, but also was involved in fighting piracy around Horn of Africa, some help to deal with African problems by African Union. So it made the problem of overstretch of forces.
It's not a global power as such, although it does have, individual countries may have global interests.
That's true, and of course, since a lot of members are at the same time members of European Union, we have common global interest. But NATO is first and foremost a tool to stabilize Europe and to defend European countries, able to deal with some other problems outside. But there is always a need of finding some kind of balance between tasks NATO had to do and have to do still.
Europe always seems to go back to seek refuge behind America's aprons when a real threat emerges. For example, there's lots of talk about the Euro armies, European common defence policy, common military units in Euro, but we always go back to NATO.
It's true, and without America, NATO won't be as effective as it is. That's definitely. Americans bring, let's say, a lot of hardware and a lot of capabilities. However, I wouldn't underestimate the role of Europeans, especially now. Of course, there are still, to some degree, maybe not junior partners, but those who, individually speaking, obviously, Montenegro or Latvia cannot be treated as a player who can deal with a lot of problems. But that's objective state of affairs. Nevertheless, altogether, Europeans, especially now after, let's say, revival of their thinking about defense as serious matter, as something which requires spending, requires attention, and so on, I think that Europeans are not, let's say, irrelevant in this. Of course, without Americans, NATO won't be as effective. But on the other hand, having, let's say, reliable partners in Europe is also a big benefit for the US in context of the global interest as well. So having maybe not military support, but political support somewhere else is also important for them. Knowing that Europeans are capable more and more to do some things, maybe not alone, but rather with, let's say, bigger role in the process, allows Americans to think about other problems more, let's say, independently.
Let's go to the financial question. The great criticism by President Trump was that Europeans aren't paying their way and we will abandon them if they don't pay up. But more NATO members are actually meeting their 2% targets.
It's true. First of all, it has changed because currently probably some 23 of 32 countries will meet that target this year, which is a huge improvement. However, I think that also the problem is that we even made a fetish of 2% GDP. The problem is that it's not only how much you spend, it's also for what you spend. That is, I agree that we need to spend more, and 2% GDP is a good level for some kind of start. Sometimes maybe it's even more, as we should be spent as NATO agreed, by the way, on this summit in Washington. But nevertheless, it's also a question how you spend money. And knowing, for example, that the Netherlands, for many years, they spent less than 2%, but at the same time, they were perceived as an ally who spent, let's say, wisely, and in a way which is really improving NATO capabilities. So that also has to be taken into account. So that's why the dispute over financing was very often so twisted by the focus on just the number without reflection on what exactly the numbers means. Unfortunately, it also means that you can spend 4% of your GDP and it doesn't have to be very effective from the perspective of the alliance.
What about the European or the NATO industrial base? Is that we've seen from ever since Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time that industrial quantity, the production of ammunition, and in particular, the production of lots and lots of cheaper quantity versus quality. Have we got the balance right in NATO thinking, do you think?
Oh, well, first
or are you
of
spending
all,
too much on the gold-plated armaments that are too expensive?
It's not only a question of quality versus quantity, because it's also a question simply of quantity. And the problem which was revealed to some degree by the war in Ukraine is that Europeans especially, but also Americans, have to think about ability to recreate their capabilities to produce, for example, especially ammunition, less weapons as such, but ammunition in sufficient numbers relatively quickly. So that's something which we have to improve, and definitely that was the weakness to some degree which was revealed. However, on the other hand, it's good that we know that and we are improving here. What I would like to stress also that it is also the issue of European base as such, that is cooperation within the European Union and so on, because that's the field of cooperation of industries, and that's more industrial cooperation than defense cooperation. NATO is more responsible for using resources we have. It could inspire countries and people to invest, or could, let's say, guide investments and so on, but it's not the tool, although it has some capabilities here, but not the main tool to organize cooperation in this matter. Maybe scientific, yes, but not so much industrial. On this summit, NATO stepped in and planned or proposed some kind of strategy of developing some capabilities here. That's good that NATO made commitments here, but without, let's say, good cooperation also with European Union and individual activities of the states, it won't happen, because NATO as an institution has no factories, no industry as such. It has to be done by states. Nevertheless, what is very important here that NATO is much more aware, or NATO members are much more aware of the issue and much more, let's say, not only determined to do something, but they are now much more familiar what has to be done. And thanks to that, I'm sure that our capabilities to rebuild, let's say, resources we need here, and ability to, for example, produce ammunition in big numbers relatively quickly, are not so small. It's rather, let's say, to start the process sometimes, not that we have to recreate from the scratch many things. So that's good thing.
On the so-called eastward expansion of NATO, certainly the first phase of embracing Eastern Europe into its structure, it seemed to me at the time when I was a bit younger that NATO wasn't expanding eastward. It was the Eastern Europe that was going west, and this is what one of the points of friction that Russia thinks that it was an ever-expanding NATO eastwards, and no wonder that former Soviet bloc countries wanted to get out of the Warsaw Pact and get back into the West. But this, the latest move to embrace Ukraine when it's still in a war with Russia, is that a wise move? That's a specific expansion east, is it not, to invite Ukraine into NATO? Or is it just a symbolic surface thing to placate Ukrainian opinion?
I fully agree that it was more countries from Central and Eastern Europe moving westward than NATO intentionally moving eastward. In other words, NATO was not interested in, I don't know, surrounding Russia by countries that were between former West from Cold War times and Russia. It was rather the response to needs and will of these nations, which really tried. Of course, they have to meet standards, and NATO is allowing to join all of these countries which NATO wants to have as a member. But I fully agree that it was rather moving westward by Central Europeans and Eastern Europeans than moving eastward by NATO. So it means that potential membership of Ukraine is also more the question of Ukrainian ambitions, not so much some vicious plan of NATO to surround Russia or something like that. However, NATO is an alliance in which the core of it is the promise of and pledge to help in case of armed attack. So joining by the country which is already on war is problematic because it means direct involvement in conflict which NATO don't want to have and don't want to do. At least not in these circumstances. So I think that as long as the war is ongoing, the issue is still more to show the readiness to do this when time comes, not now. However, as I said, it's not, again, it will be more due to willingness to stabilize Europe as such, due to finding, let's say, some common ground between Ukraine and NATO, not due only and exclusively due to Russian. Right.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but I hope we might be here for the 80th birthday, probably not for the 150th. But thank you very much, Professor Madej, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for today. Do join us again, please, for How We Got Here.